Hello, my name is Mark Gibson, and you're listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, a weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. Hello, and you're very welcome to this morning's Signpost webinar. We hope you're keeping safe and well wherever you're joining us from this morning. Good morning, Cathal. How are you today?
Good morning, Mark. Not a bother, thanks. How are you keeping?
Right. I'm brilliant. Thanks very much. Today, we're going to be talking about managing clover to lower carbon and ammonia footprints. As we know, the farming sector continues to adapt to climate and environmental targets. And we know that clover does offer promising solutions to reducing our reliance on chemical nitrogen and improving soil quality. And we're delighted to be joined by Dr. James Humphreys, who is Principal Research Officer based in Teagasc Moor Park. James, good morning to you.
Morning, Mark. Thanks for having me.
James, you're going to be talking to us about just an update on clover. I know you're no stranger to the Signpost webinar at this stage, but how are things going in that regard in terms of the uptake of clover across the country?
Well, I think there's a good level of interest. We saw an awful lot of interest during the 2022 and 2023 when there was the massively inflated fertilizer nitrogen prices. If we look at nitrogen fertilizer used in last year, it didn't kind of rebound the way that you'd expect. So, it's hard to gauge these things, but I think there's a change in attitude towards clover out on the ground, a kind of an interest to make more use of it, to get the economic benefits that come from that. And I know I've talked about aspects of the work that we've been doing in Solihead in the past, but I've never really focused in on management. So that's really the key focus today is to, what are the management techniques that farmers can use to make sure that the clover is as productive as it can be.
Yeah. And we couldn't have picked a better time of the year for that talk.
Yeah. So important decisions need to be made this time of the year. So, yeah.
So, James, we'll hand over to you and we'll chat to you after your presentation.
Okay, so good morning, everybody. I'm going to talk about managing clover to lower carbon and ammonia footprints. The background to this, some work that we were doing in Solihead and built an earlier work at Solihead on looking at nitrous oxide emissions, which is a very important greenhouse gas. And what we found is that when you've biologically fixed nitrogen associated with clover, you have no nitrous oxide emissions. You also have no ammonia emissions. And when you factor these elements, if you can replace nitrogen fertilizer with biologically fixed nitrogen, you can substantially reduce your greenhouse gas emissions, and you can also reduce your ammonia emissions. You'll also improve profitability while maintaining output. And that's really Owen Cashman did his PhD on that, and that describes his PhD in a nutshell: high profitability, lower emissions. And then at the end of the year there, last year and early this year, we had the clover review. And I suppose it highlighted that there's been a 31% reduction in fertilizer nitrogen use. And, there's obviously that has implications for pasture production. And at the same time, there's an urgent need to consider, I think this is one of the key observations, that there was an urgent need to consider alternative sward type that maintain harvest yield at lower fertilizer nitrogen levels, which of course is something I've been working on for a long time now. And in this presentation, we'll deal mainly with managing clover under low nitrogen fertilizer, nitrogen input. But I'm just going to start by just examining the first part of this question, the reduction in fertilizer nitrogen use and what impact that has had. So if we look at, say, livestock numbers, ruminant livestock, which are dependent on our grassland resources, we can see here during that 6-year period, dairy cow numbers increased from 1.48 to 1.65 million. Steady increase during that period of 11%. At the same time, suckler cows went down, more or less proportionately. And the overall impact then on cow numbers was little or no change, going from 2.53 to 2.52 million. It virtually didn't change. And likewise, cattle numbers, same number of cows, same number of cattle. It's just we've more cattle coming off the dairy herd rather than the suckler herd in the past. I suppose the surprising thing is that there's been a big increase in yaw numbers up until 23. And I guess that was driven by the high price of lamb and 11% increase in total sheep numbers. And when you look at that in aggregate, then you can say that if anything, despite this reduction in fertilizer and nitrogen use, there has been an increase in livestock numbers on grassland farms. If we look at fertilizer, you can see very high levels of fertilizer used in 2018, which is the baseline year for the Climate Action Plan. And if you try to put that in context, it was in the context of very low summer rainfall in June and July of that year, where any fertilizer that had gone on probably was used very inefficiently during the dry spell. And then at the end of the dry spell, at the end of July into August, farmers drove on with fertilizer in an attempt to rebuild silage stocks. So overall, you'd say about 2018 wasn't a particularly good grass growing year. It was actually a poor grass growing year, but very high fertilizer use that year. Things returned to more normal rates or levels of national use in 19 and 20. And you can see expenditure came down accordingly. Then we had the lockdown in 2020, and that tended to drive inflation. And look at 21, then fertilizer use went back up to around 400,000 tons, and expenditure increased because fertilizer prices were rising at that time, even prior to the war in Ukraine, which kicked off then in February. And then we see a reduction in use, but massive increase in expenditure on fertilizer, 3 times higher than was used in 2020. And really the reduction, when you look at it in this context, is that farmers were adjusting their usage in line with these massively inflated costs and adjusting to it. And as I said already, we had huge numbers of farmers going through Salahead at that time with an interest trying to find ways to look for alternatives, which is the obvious thing you'll do under very high prices. And then fertilizer use came down even further last year to historic low levels, even though expenditure remained relatively high because of the high price. Prices still haven't come back down to pre-21 levels. And I suppose the thing it shows as well as this is the price, how sensitive fertilizer use is to price, that farmers adjust accordingly. If we look at the value of output and operating surplus on farms, we can see that during this period there was, for the most part, a steady increase in operating surplus. And even though fertilizer prices got very high in 22, milk prices were proportionately higher. We see a reduction then in 23, which is, milk prices are coming back, but we still were dealing with high inflation. If we look at the value of exports, of dairy, meat and livestock exports coming off grassland farms again, we can see steady increase and then a jump there in 22 and 23, probably driven more by inflation than anything else, higher prices. If we look at what happened in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, the big one, of course, is enteric fermentation, which is methane from ruminant livestock. And we can see, in line with what I said already in terms of cattle and sheep numbers, if anything, a small increase in emissions during that time frame from enteric fermentation. The big reduction, of course, here is agricultural soils, which encompasses fertilizer, nitrogen use, and dung and urine deposited by grazing livestock. Now, if we take into account that livestock numbers haven't changed to any great extent, all of this, or virtually all of this reduction here can be put down to fertilizer and nitrogen. And the impact of that then in terms of total emissions, we can see a 3% reduction in emissions relative to the 2018 baseline, which I'd say is a step in the right direction and a positive outcome, but still relative to reducing emissions by 25% by 2030, it's a, there's a big challenge there still to be achieved. Ammonia emissions then, a very similar story, so I won't dwell on it. Lower fertilizer use gave us lower emissions, and the impact on ammonia was even greater than greenhouse gases, a 10% reduction in ammonia emissions, of course, a very positive story. And then if we look at nitrate levels, this is from the EPA indicators report, and I lifted it out straight from that report, and you can see a steady decline, well, somewhat of a decline, and I guess this needs to be treated with a certain amount of caution. But what we're looking at here is 15 to 20% reduction in nitrate concentrations in river water, which, you know, that's positive, and that has implications for the nitrates directive and the continuation of the derogation, and I guess that all has to play out, but it is a positive story. So then if we look at that overall picture, 31% reduction in fertilizer nitrogen use. That was driven by the high cost of fertilizer nitrogen, which was a crisis for Irish grassland farming in 22 and 23. And you could say the farmers adjusted very well to that crisis, because output and profitability were resilient despite these massively inflated fertilizer and other costs. And I suppose one thing that gets lost in this argument, and I suppose what I'm trying to drive at here, is if fertilizer nitrogen had remained at 2021 levels, you know, that would have resulted in even higher fertilizer expenditure. So when we look at it relative to a baseline, say here, 2018, the saving on fertilizer nitrogen was around 0.43 billion. Or if we look at it compared to when there was lower nitrogen used in 2020, if fertilizer had stayed at the same rate and in those years, it would have been huge levels, much higher expenditure than transpired. And that's a saving. That has to be looked at as a positive outcome. Average it over 130,000 farms in Ireland, you could say it's working out at around €3,000 per farm, which is, you know, not insubstantial. So there's big savings, 3% lower greenhouse gas emissions despite higher ruminant livestock numbers. Positive story, 10% lower ammonia emissions, and a downward trend in nitrate concentrations in river water. And therefore, there were very clear benefits from lower fertilizer use. And that brings me back to the second part of the clover review, saying that we have this urgent need for alternative sward types to maintain harvest production at lower fertilizer nitrogen input. And basically, I think that we have the opportunity to build on the very positive story that has transpired over the last couple of years. So then the question is, how much grass can we grow with low fertilizer nitrogen? And this is from 3 studies. Emma Buckley presented a more comprehensive data set earlier this year on the Signpost series, but just to reiterate this, we can see long-term study here in Salahead, 3 scenarios, high nitrogen situation, high nitrogen system where we were putting on between 280 and 250 kilos of nitrogen per hectare per year. The red dot here is protected urea, 60 kilos per hectare on clover swards. And then since 2019, we started running the zero nitrogen system, which is the hollow symbol. And I suppose this was kind of inspired by earlier work that was done in Moore Park, where there was 250 kilos of nitrogen per hectare here compared to 60, the red dot compared to 0, a 3-year study published in 2015. And since then, we've been rolling this out on commercial farms, the low carbon dairy farmers, and on each of the farms have the high nitrogen system here, which is the blue, which averaged out around 210 kilos nitrogen per hectare. And they can either have all 3 options or one of the other 2 options, which is, say, the lower, the 0. And again, we're seeing similar lack of differences between high nitrogen systems and clover-based systems getting lower no nitrogen fertilizer, which means that we can maintain production even with 0 fertilizer nitrogen input. And this is all published. And I suppose it's important to say that it is underpinned by the peer review process. So then the question is, how does this work? How does this low nitrogen system work? And I guess what we found in our studies, and it's also in other studies, is that for every ton of clover dry matter that we'll grow, we'll fix around 50 kilos nitrogen per hectare. So the key to high productivity is to have high levels of clover in the sward. And that can be achieved when there's little or no nitrogen fertilizer going in. So our target is, and kind of we'll hit this target on occasion, is to grow around 5 tons of clover dry matter. So each ton give you is 50 kilos, that's 250 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. Background nitrogen then at Salahead, and this is the background capacity of the soil. to supply nitrogen, and all soils have this capacity to varying degrees. And I guess, if you don't put any fertilizer, no slurry, no clover, you'll still grow 6 tons of grass or so. And that's supplied by this background release of nitrogen from the soil organic matter, which in soil ahead is around 150 kilos per hectare, which is about the average for the country. And then you have a certain amount of slurry that's recycled, primarily in slurry, about 50 kilos. And when you add all that up, it's a simple budget. 450 kilos is of available nitrogen. It takes around 30 kilos of nitrogen to grow a ton of dry matter. So that gives us 15 tons, which is close to, we're not quite achieving that, but close to it. And around 1/3 of that then is clover when there's zero nitrogen system. So we're growing 5 tons. So in round figures, that gives us 250 kilos. So I hope that makes sense. But that's really the high levels of fixation that are underpinning this. And to get up to this clover yield, you need to have low rates of fertilizer nitrogen or none. And this graph shows what happens when you put on high nitrogen. And this is well known. When you put on nitrogen fertilizer, you're going to drive the clover out of the sward. It mightn't happen immediately, but it's a gradual process where the grass can outcompete the clover, shade out the clover when there's a lot of nitrogen available in the soil, and eventually the clover will disappear. So we can have 2 scenarios here, for example, a very high clover sward. If we apply high nitrogen onto that over the course of maybe 2 years, you can very quickly then end up with a situation where there's no clover in the sward. So, you're back to square one and back to a reliance on fertilizer nitrogen. So how does biological nitrogen fixation work? It's a question I'm often asked. So we have the clover sward. It's capturing sunlight, photosynthesizing sugars. It passes these sugars down into the root system, where you have these nodules, and you have bacteria that live in the nodules, and the clover supplies them with sugar, and they produce ammonium. They convert atmospheric nitrogen, which is not plant available, into an available form, a plant available form of nitrogen, which is ammonium, as in calcium ammonium nitrate in can, for example. And it produces that nitrogen in the nodules, and then that just leaks out into the soil solution. And that nitrogen then is available in the soil solution, same as fertilizer nitrogen or anything else, and it can be taken up by the sward. And this works best when there isn't a high concentration of nitrogen in the soil solution, where you have a steady offtake by the sward. And in my opinion, clover-based systems work best when there is a mild deficiency of nitrogen in the soil. You need to have a certain amount of hunger to keep it in the game, and also to keep down the competition from the accompanying grass. And if in a situation where we put on high nitrogen and the soil gets elevated, soil nitrogen levels get elevated, there's a couple of things happen. The first thing that happens is that there's a feedback, which tends to slow down the rate of biological nitrogen fixation. It doesn't stop it, but it slows it down. And the other thing happens, the longer term effect, as I said already, you get increasing competition from the grass. The high nitrogen suits the grass, and at the expense of the clover. The other aspect of this, in the longer term, if you have a clover fixing a lot of nitrogen, it will tend to drive itself out of the sward for the same reasons. And there are considerations around management that we could take into account from that point of view. So there is this issue with clover persistence. It was raised in the review. And I'm using this example here of the colander, where you're constantly dealing with a situation where you're losing clover, and that's something that needs to be managed. And the rate of loss here depends on grassland management. And the number one aspect of that is fertilizer nitrogen use. So the more fertilizer you use, nitrogen fertilizer you use, it's like opening up the pores in that colander. You're going to speed up the rate of loss. The less nitrogen fertilizer, if you go down to 0, you're going to slow down that rate of loss. And that's an important consideration. And then the rate of replenishment here depends on the rate of reseeding. So we kind of target a reseeding rate of around 10% per year in terms of what's economically possible, because there is a cost with it. And there's also the whole issue of how much ground you can take out of production at any one time, which is another cost to the system. So overall, what's the relationship between fertilizer nitrogen and biological nitrogen fixation? This is from Owen Cashin's PhD, where we see more or less a 1-for-1 replacement of fertilizer nitrogen by biological nitrogen fixation and vice versa. So if we have a sward like this, for example, we put high nitrogen onto it, we're not going to really get any response. Put on nitrogen fertilizer, we're not going to get a response to that. We're just going to drive the clover out of the sward. We're going to shorten the useful life of the clover. And then we end back in this situation. And basically, when we've no clover in the sward, we get no biological nitrogen fixation. So as I said, we're reliant on using fertilizer. Another thing that has a big impact, and again, it's the issue of competition between grass and clover, is the winter cover. And if we look at these three scenarios here where we have a very low cover, and it's kind of easy to understand how clover will survive very well in this situation, and that you'll have very high clover contents in the following year. And if you contrast this with this other situation here where there's a very high winter cover, so high in fact that the sward is getting burnt by frost and also dying back due to high respiration because it's carrying such a high cover over the winter. And you can see the clover isn't going to survive very well in this situation. Of course, in this situation, you've plenty of grass in the spring. In this situation, things are going to be tight. So there is a trade-off there. And that's a trade-off that needs to be managed. So if we look at, say, the management decisions on a farm over the course of the year, where we're reseeding 10% of the farm every year with clover. So for the first few years, we've got good clover in the sward. And then there is a risk over time that clover will start to decline. You can manage that decline, but just we'll leave it at this for the time being, because this is really where we are with the low carbon dairy farmers group as things stand. In terms of fertilizer nitrogen input, little or no nitrogen on this part of the farm. You're making the clover work. And then you decide there's just not enough clover anymore, so we're going to switch back to a high nitrogen situation. Say, and because you're using little or no nitrogen on this part of the farm, it gives you much greater flexibility in terms of fertilizer nitrogen use on this half. So really what we're aiming to achieve here is maximizing nitrogen fixation on this part of the farm and maximizing in fertilization on the other part. And if you look at all of the options for fertilizer use and in combination with clover, this is by far the best way that you're going to grow the maximum amount of grass on the farm. In terms of managing winter covers then, and it's important to set up a wedge in the autumn to have grass in the spring. Really the higher covers here indicated by the darker colors is where there's nitrogen being used. We're not worrying too much about the clover on this part of the farm, and particularly in these paddocks here that are due to be reseeded next year. And then we have the lower end of the wedge here on the clover swards, where we graze them last before the winter, particularly these paddocks here where we're concerned about clover contents, declining clover contents, and trying to improve that. And an awful lot can be done to improve those clover contents by a low winter cover and by targeting those paddocks with a low winter cover. Another thing that we can do is taking off silage bales, because I said already, if we can take nitrogen out of the ground, and silage will take more nitrogen out, say, than grazing, for example, where a lot of nitrogen is being recycled. But if we can take that nitrogen out, if we took off 3, 4, 5 tons of dry matter per hectare in harvested silage, you're taking off between 90 and 150 kilos nitrogen per hectare. So that, again, that puts the balance, the competitive balance back in favor of the clover when you've this nitrogen mined out. It might sound counterintuitive that you try mining nitrogen out of a declining clover sward, but it actually helps to reinvigorate the clover. So again, we target the paddocks here where the clover's in decline. And if, like this in the grazing platform scenario, where you're limited amount of silage coming off, maybe some surplus is generated during late May. So you are taking off some silage, but not a lot. And I'd say if you were taking silage off this part of the farm, for example, or this part of the grazing platform, it's a missed opportunity because you get no benefit, whereas the clear benefit from taking off these bale surpluses here. The other thing you could do is consider oversowing. Oversowing is very hit and miss. Could be combined with, say, baling surpluses, for example. But again, if you were to oversow to try to reinvigorate a clover sward, I'd be trying to do it at this stage of the cycle where there's still plenty of clover in the sward. It's in decline, but you're trying to reverse that decline. because one of the keys to oversowing, in my opinion, is that you don't put on nitrogen fertilizer, because what all you're doing is driving on the grass in competition to the clover seedlings. So if you still have enough clover in the sward, you can there's still enough nitrogen in to keep the thing productive. Whereas if you start oversowing here, where the clover is more or less gone, you're in a situation then where there's nothing to drive growth. The other thing, of course, when you have a nice bit of clover in the sward, it tends to leave the sward more open, which helps the oversowing to work better. So a key to this, or key to priming up the whole system, is reseeding. And this is the kind of approach we've taken with the farm to manage a reseed and manageable area of the farm every year, ideally in April. Putting on lime during reseeding to bring the soil pH up to between 6.5 and 7, which is important for nitrogen fixation. Putting on 2 bags of 10-10-20 to speed up establishment, to get rapid establishment of the sward, and then no more fertilizer nitrogen after that for the remainder of the year, because you want to let the sward develop its capacity to fix nitrogen. And this is really a challenge we set out for the group when we set it up back in 2020-21, that this was one of the, almost a kind of an initiation right into the group, that no fertilizer nitrogen on reseeded swards, as a very good way of learning what nitrogen fixation can do. And another very important aspect of reseeding is to put on post-emergence herbicide for dock control, because you have that option to control docks in clover swards in the reseed. You've no real good options subsequently, so you either take that opportunity or don't, and if you don't, more likely you'll regret it. So it's important to get that right. So then there's a question of when fixation kicks off. Normally starts at around 6 weeks, and there can be substantial rates of fixation in the establishment year, assuming you get good establishment of the clover and there's plenty clover in the sward. So as I said, this is one of the challenges we set up for the Low Carbon Dairy Farmers Group in the beginning. And this spring, when we were planning for reseeding this year, I put this question to the group: I'd like your opinion on fertilizer nitrogen use on reseeded swards with high clover content after establishment. And you can see the response there, unanimously in favor of no fertilizer nitrogen. And this is now 4 years into the project. So, these farmers, commercial farmers, have good experience of it, and for some of them, for all of them, there's this substantial investment in reseeding at stake here. So there's no room for any compromise in terms of achieving high production, and like the experience. And I think it speaks for itself. Now there's 28 farmers in the group, so we didn't get a full response rate, but still 2/3 of the group said they were not going to use nitrogen fertilizer. Of course, if you're not going to use nitrogen fertilizer on the reseed, it's key that you have high levels of fixation and that there's plenty of clover in the sward. And again, these are the 2 seed mixtures that we've selected this year for grazing. And it's, again, a group decision, but 9 kilos of perennial ryegrass, 2 kilos of red clover, and 2 kilos of white clover. So similar enough mixes. And farmers can pick and choose, because I think when we set out, again, going back to the start of the group back in 2021, farmers were using a variety of different seed mixes that they picked up from various sources, and some of them were questionable. So since then, we've made this option available where they can use these recommended mixes, which have high clover contents. We've red clover in the mix, which is a bit unusual in the grazing mix, but we've been using that now for the last 7 or 8 years. And the initial idea was that this would help to boost production in the establishment year, maybe the first couple of years. It's actually persisting better than that. And clearly red clover gives high rates of fixation in the establishment year. So it's a very useful addition to the seed mixture. If you have high levels of clover, because of these type of seed mixtures and low fertilizer nitrogen use, there is the risk of bloat, and it's a real risk to animal welfare. It's also a risk to the welfare of the farmer, because it adds stress. There's no doubt about it. But it's a measurable risk, and it's a manageable risk. And in my experience, I have a lot of experience of clover over the years, that the risk is somewhere between grass tetany and milk fever. And there are two risks that are on farms, and two risks that also need to be managed, and there's a cost associated with managing it. And if you are going down the clover route and going to develop more clover in the swards, it's another risk that needs to be taken on board. And again, it's a risk that needs to be managed. There's no point in sitting on your hands. You just need to get on and do something about it. So you could, bloat oil is the obvious thing, and you can go high tech with that, or you can go low tech depending on how far into it you're planning to go. There are other management things that you can bring into it, say using this 2-hour strip here when you're first introducing cows into a new allocation of high clover sward. Like the worst case scenario is like cows in and they'll skim over the surface and just skim off the clover off the surface of the sward, the clover leaves, which is probably going to lead to problems. If you can initially get them, when you're introducing them first, to graze down into the butt of the sward, they get more fiber in their diet, which tends to balance out, and then you can let them off over the remainder of the break. And the other thing is, because there is still a risk of bloat, say going into October, November, if you're buffer feeding silage, for example, at that time of the year, that really guarantees no risk, takes risk out of the equation entirely. And I think this is a question for research. There is a researchable question here that we need to find solutions. And I think that the solution will lie in increasing the fiber content of our diets, balancing out the very highly digestible clover, which leads to the bloat. The last thing then I'm going to talk about is sulfur, because it's a question that often comes up. If you're not using nitrogen fertilizer, you're using very little, how do you integrate in sulfur cost effectively? So you have these nitrogen-containing compounds here, which could be used, say, in the early spring, February, March, that contain sulfur. If you are putting some nitrogen on in the spring, the problem with these is that you're probably putting on the sulfur a bit earlier than you'd like. Ideally, you'd be putting on the sulfur more in April time. You then have the potassium-containing sulfur products like sulfate of potash. and this could be an ideal fertilizer, say, for first cut silage, where if you wanted to put on 100 units of K onto your clover swards, bag of muriate of potash and a bag of sulfate of potash, which give you 92 units of K and 18 units of sulfur, which is ideal, set you up for the year. And then you have the thing about sulfate of potash, it's relatively expensive. And you have another product here, polysulfate, 12% K, 19% sulfur. And this is kind of ideal for the grazing platform, where you can put a round of this on in April. Doesn't contain so much K that it's going to cause a problem with grass tetany, but again, it gives you an ideal amount of sulfur, set you up for the year, as I said. So just in some final comments, lower fertilizer nitrogen use on the clover sward lowers costs, gives higher profits, lower emissions, and as I said, that's Owen Cashman's thesis in a nutshell. High productivity can be achieved under lower zero nitrogen fertilizer input, and one of the big benefits long term, because we often think short terms about these things, you have to think about the long term persistence of the clover, which is what drives the long term economic performance. The more you can get out of your clover, the less fertilizer nitrogen you can use. If I give the example where we half the farm under clover for 5 years and the other half kind of high nitrogen, the more you can extend that, obviously, the more profitable your farm will be. And we see that on the low carbon dairy farms, where there's been substantial saving in nitrogen fertilizer costs over the last 3 years. Bloat is a risk, but it's a risk that can be managed, and it's kind of a matter of getting used to it. We need seed mixtures then that will give high yields of clover and high biological nitrogen fixation. I think what we've seen, particularly in 22 and 23, when there was a big increase in demand for clover seed, some questionable mixtures being sold with some questionable varieties in it. And I think if you really want to get high productivity, you need to have high quality seed mixtures. And if we saw a greater move in this direction, I think we are seeing it. It's a very cost-effective means of lowering national greenhouse gas and ammonia emissions. If we look at the alternatives, say even using protected urea, which lower emissions, there's still a cost with it. If we talk about feed additives, big question there is who's going to pay for it. So, but the clover it's very cost effective and has that benefit. So just to acknowledge then the low carbon dairy farmers that have been giving us their data, and also we've had substantial funding from DAFM for these projects over the years. So thank you.
Thanks very much, James. Really enjoyed that presentation, and it's great to pull it all together and take stock, I suppose, of where the clover research and advice is at. You talked about the different species of clover in one of your slides there. Is there much of a variation between species of clover and their ability to fix nitrogen, or is that something that is part of the selection process? And I don't want to go into a deep dive on it today, but is that something that people need to be conscious of?
There's massive differences. Like if we talk about grasses, for example, not even just perennial rye grasses, but if we talked about, say, Timothy or tall fescue or whatever, grass is grass. It grows, to the non-expert, they're hard enough to see the difference between them. But if we take white clover and red clover, for example, they're very, very different. Like white clover, I would put down as being, if you ever see ivy growing up a wall, it kind of grows along the surface of the ground like that. Or as a group of farmers from Wexford said to me once, it's like strawberries. I've no experience with strawberries, but if you ever, for me, you see ivy growing up a wall, that's my way of visualizing how white clover grows. Whereas red clover then is very different. It has very little capacity to spread out. It's a deep tap-rooted species. It's more reminiscent of a dock, for example. So they're very different. We have looked at other clovers as additions to reseeds to speed up the rate of fixation after establishment. And I think there are some possibilities there, but I think for the most part, it's going to be white clover, number one, red clover, and then maybe lucerne or alfalfa.
Okay. One of your slides there, you talked about the greenhouse gas emissions, the impact on greenhouse gas emissions, and you mentioned a figure of 3%. Could you just talk to us about that again and just clarify that figure?
So when we look at or when the EPA compile these inventories, it's the national inventory. So the main thing is the herd, the national herd. So you have the dairy cows, suckler cows, cattle 1 to 2. So each of those are allocated emission factor. 2 are multiplied together and it's all added up. And that's the big proportion of our national emissions. Then you have the other proportions, say that there's emission factors for nitrogen fertilizer use, for example. There's emission factors for slurry spreading. And all of these are compiled in an inventory. And what we've seen since 2018, which is the baseline for the Climate Action Plan, the Climate Action Plan lays out a target of a 25% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture by 2030, as you well know. And then the question is, how are we progressing towards that target? So over the last 6 years, we've seen a 3% reduction. And when you dig into that, you could say that maybe not entirely, but a large part of that reduction has come from lower fertilizer and nitrogen use, driven, of course, by high costs and the war in the Ukraine. So you could say it was as to some extent by accident rather than design, because nobody planned for the war in the Ukraine, as you can imagine. But still, it's a positive step.
So there is a price sensitivity, and I'm sure also the price of beef as well is likely to have an impact there on from the other side as well.
Well, if you look at the situation this year, it's gone completely off the scale. So, But and again, like if you look at, say, our analysis, if you can keep your costs down and when prices are high, you're winning. And like if you look at 22, when we had high milk prices, high fertilizer prices, and then in 23 we lower milk prices, but prices in general stayed high. That's really when clover comes into its own in terms of protecting farm incomes. More so even than when you think clover would win out very well when fertilizer prices are high. That's obvious. What's not so obvious is that clover can be very good at preserving farm incomes when output prices are low because it keeps costs low. So proportionally speaking, it actually has a more of an impact when anyway, I won't go into it.
No, it's a really important point, because I mean, where we're trying to build resilience into farming systems, I think it's a really important element of that picture. So that's it. Certainly speaks to that. Cathal has some really good questions coming in. I see from our audience.
Yeah, some nice technical questions. We did a poll last week, and I think 25% of our audience were farmers last week. So I'm assuming the same again this week. So I have some real nice technical farming questions for you, James. Just one point of clarification. You're mainly dealing with white clover, aren't you, today?
White clover primarily, yeah. And, I did a webinar a couple of years ago on red clover, managing red clover, specifically kind of coincided with the start of the red clover scheme. So I focused entirely on that at that time. This is primarily for grazing management, what I was talking about today.
And there's kind of a question here around, I think you mentioned it takes 30 kgs of nitrogen to grow a ton of herbage. Does that assume 100% efficiency, or does it account for losses?
Well, look, it's a rough figure because it varies a certain amount of, it's a rule of thumb, we'll say. But if we look at the efficiency of like how we calculate biological nitrogen fixation, if we look at, say, fertilizer use, generally speaking, biological nitrogen fixation is used very efficiently. It's kind of a slow release fertilizer. And if we look at fertilizer use, normally we'll use nitrogen fertilizer that we apply in terms of uptake in the sward at a rate of around 75%. Can be lower in the spring, higher during the summer. On average for the year, 75%. If we look at biological nitrogen fixation, it's much higher than that. So the nitrogen fertilizer replacement value of biological nitrogen fixation is high, higher. So what I'm trying to say is, if we were fixing 250 kilos nitrogen per hectare, this is a nitrogen fertilizer replacement value of 275 kilos, if that makes sense. And the reason for that, and if you look into the reason why we get low emissions, low nitrous oxide emissions, low ammonia emissions, is because the fixation takes place underground, and it takes place at a slow and steady rate. So really, the nitrogen we're getting from clover is a slow release fertilizer. It's being made available at a rate of maybe one or 2 kilos per hectare per day, and it's been taken up at a rate of 1 or 2 kilos per hectare per day. So there's no, like, if you put on a bag of urea per acre, for example, you have 60 kilos nitrogen per hectare sitting there on the ground. That'll be taken up at a rate of 1 kilo per day. So there's 59 kilos initially that's at risk of being lost, if you can imagine and that's just sitting there at risk. Whereas with the clover, you don't have that risk because you have the steady release. And as I was kind of saying, if you can keep your soil mildly deficient in nitrogen, that's really when clover is going to work at its best.
That leads nicely into the next question. A couple of farmers asked me lately, and it's in the questions here as well, about have you done any work on nitrate leaching as regards clover? And I think you've kind of started into that question already in what you're saying.
You see, it is a question. We've measured nitrate leaching in solid head. We have a massive data set. The problem with that is we don't get nitrate leaching in solid head. I know it's a strange thing to say. The nature of the soil in solid head really, if we're going to lose nitrogen out of our system, we lose it as a gas because of the very heavy nature of the soil. The nitrate doesn't make it down through the more clay, dense layers. They get captured, attenuated, they say, by the denitrifying bacteria, which break down the nitrate and release it off as a gas, either as nitrous oxide or as dinitrogen gas or as ammonia. And I guess that was part of William Birch's PhD thesis. About half of nitrogen that we were losing in solid head was environmentally benign dinitrogen gas. Now, that might sound strange, but if you think about it, when we're manufacturing nitrogen fertilizer, or if we're fixing nitrogen fertilizer, it's coming out of the atmosphere. It's being captured out of the atmosphere, converted into a plant available form, put into the soil, and all that nitrogen really wants to do is to get back into the atmosphere, which is its natural stable state. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah.
But we often think about fertilizer as a solid, and but really it's most of the nitrogen, the vast majority of nitrogen on the planet is in a gaseous form.
Yeah, and I think I suppose I'm going to say an assumption here, and it's really bad for a scientist to say that, but I'll say it anyway. So hopefully you can answer it. But so we know that the clover is more reactive to temperature than say grass. A clover is it around 10 degrees? It's we know in the springtime it's slower to start, and then can we assume then in the back end of the year when we don't want that nitrogen surplus in soil that clover will slow down before grass, and maybe grass will take up some of that surplus?
I've no doubt now, and I guess the study needs to be done on a free draining soil, that clover will give you lower nitrate leachings, or everything else being equal, than a high nitrogen system. Where, and it goes back to some extent to what I was saying about how nitrogen becomes available and this almost just in time supply capacity. Like the really strong thing about permanent grassland is the fact that we'll continue to take up nitrogen over the winter. Our grass continues to grow. I don't know, we did calculation once, you could take up a ton of nitrogen, ton and a half of nitrogen off the top of my head now. No, what am I saying? 40, you could grow a ton, you take up maybe 45 kilos of nitrogen per hectare over the course of the winter, depending on when you set your start date in October, for example, through to February. So there is substantial capacity there to take up any residual nitrogen that's there, and I guess you should tie it in with your management. The question then is, if you have a huge amount of clover, is that giving you a flush of nitrogen at the back end of the year? I think that's probably exaggerated, that risk. That still needs to be tested.
Yeah. No, that's fair enough. And there's a kind of commentary around, a lot of farmers have visited Solihull, and the fertility is quite good in Solihull. Have you replicated, I suppose, in different areas and getting the same results? Or can you comment maybe on P&K levels and lime and that you get the same results you're getting maybe there?
I think if you're a professional farmer and this has come up, if you don't have your P&K and lime right, you'd have to ask serious questions, because that's fundamental to what you're doing. Now, the P levels in Solihull were high. That's historically because of the dairy sludge that was floating the farm. But that stopped in 1991, and I keep having to repeat that. That was a long time ago. Our K levels, we kept them high, and I think that's nothing other than good management. Our soil pHs, we probably focus more on that in recent years and getting those up. Typically, we'd have been happy around 6.2 to recommend it. We've pushed everything above 6.5. And I think that's where you need to be for clover. And I think that's part of it, but that's nothing other than good management. So then, okay, things work very well in Solihull. The idea then was to take this out onto farms, and we tried to get as wide a geographical distribution as we can. We've farms in Cork and Wicklow and up in Donegal, because I can remember talking here before and somebody said, well, how's this going to work in Mayo? So we're trying to see how it will work in Mayo. But when you look at the results coming back, and again, we've 3 years into our 4th year now of data collected. It's off that pasture base where we have a direct comparison within individual farms. Like it's really surprising the way that it's working so well, and that the group is progressing very well. And like I showed the poll there about using nitrogen fertilizer on the reseeds. When you have that level of confidence that has built up over the years, I think it says something about how well it's working.
I had a question there, James, just in relation to 2024. I think the signs are that the fertilizer use did go up last year. Any comments in terms of clover performance and uptake last year?
Well, like last year was an absolute disaster. It was in a very, probably one of the most difficult years that I can remember. If you take from July 23 through to May 24, very high rainfall, very difficult grazing conditions last autumn, very high covers over the winter, very difficult grazing conditions last spring. If you think about last spring and contrasted with this spring, you couldn't have two more contrasting springs. And that certainly was very difficult for managing clover, high winter covers, very poor grazing conditions. If we contrast it, this year, we had relatively poor growth this winter, excellent grazing conditions so far. And we could use rain now, but so far it's been very good. You'd be thinking this year is going to be a bumper year for clover and big possibilities to make savings. But look, last year was a very difficult year, and really it didn't come right until July. Some tough questions about how to manage fertilizer and if growth isn't performing because things weren't going well. And this again is something we dealt with in the group. And when you look at the data coming back, putting on nitrogen fertilizer didn't really solve anything. That when grass was growing poorly, grass clover was performing just as badly as fertilized nitrogen and vice versa. When the conditions weren't there to support good growing conditions, it didn't matter. And like that's a hard lesson to learn because we've done the zero nitrogen thing now for a good number of years. And initially, like with no real, you're not putting on nitrogen in the spring. Is this thing going to work at all? And then you learn over a number of years, yeah, it works. And the more experience you get with it, you learn that, there is not that much of a difference between a high clover system, which is supplying nitrogen in one way, rather than a fertilized nitrogen system, which is supplying nitrogen the same way, but in a different way, but it's still achieving the same result. The type of growth rates you get and everything else, the same conditions are there that are driving growth. Like fertilizer doesn't really drive growth. Like if the conditions aren't there, there's very little going to change that. And as a farmer, what you're trying to do is just make sure there is enough nitrogen in the soil to support that growth when the growth comes. If you can understand that way of looking at the question.
Can I just ask? It's a bigger question, I suppose, in terms of the adoption of clover across farms in Ireland. Do you think that more could be done to support the adoption across the country, and what might that look like?
Well, I think it like this is a bigger question for Teagasc. I guess some of the work we're doing is maybe on the cutting edge and a bit experimental. So you have to be small, be careful about what you say. I think it's fine for us to report what we're doing, and we're road testing on farms. And I think again the wide geographical basis there is partly to disseminate it over as wide a possible an area as possible, but that is a bigger question for Teagasc and how to go about that. And of course, you have the Signpost Series and or the Signpost program, I should say, and clover is a key aspect of that program. And then you've grass tin as well, of course. So there is a lot being done. So, yeah, and I guess the clover review was conducted for that purpose, to see again to question what we're recommending about the whole question of, say, multi-species swards. And I think the review went through its process and it recommended more, as I said, managing clover under low nitrogen input was a key recommendation.
Yeah,
and I think that's part of the question: how much nitrogen we're going to recommend for these swards going forward.
And I think that's like you described the road testing on farms. That's really important that people, if somebody wants to find out more about that, we can include some links there in terms of the farms, the Signpost farms. What about the other farms, the demonstration farms? Then there's a website there, James. Is there for those?
For our group or for, say, Grass Tin or Signpost?
Yes, your own group.
No, we don't have a website.
Okay.
Maybe it's something we should have, but no.
Yeah, there's even a good few technical questions there at the moment. So there's lots of learning still to do, and that's we know, like, if people are not sure about something, they won't do it. But even something here has come up there, James, and I know you mentioned it. The difference between when, I suppose, the clover fixes and it's available to grass around, the difference between white and red clover, what's the time difference? People always confused when the availability comes up.
Yeah, and look, I think I've been reseeding clover swards for 30 years. I think we first put in the first experimentized Walden back in 1993. We've never put nitrogen fertilizer onto reseeds bar 10-20 for establishment. And like clover will fix nitrogen fairly shortly, within 6 weeks or so of establishment, and it will fix substantial rates of nitrogen.
That's white clover.
White clover,
yeah.
red clover. Yeah. If we say red clover, certainly in the early years will fix a lot more nitrogen, and you're talking huge amounts of nitrogen. Red clover has a capacity, certainly in the first year after establishment, 300 kilos nitrogen per hectare would be within what's possible. And again, if we were to emphasize that, if we go back to the group, like there's one guy in the group, for example, he's receiving 40 acres this year. That's a substantial investment. If he's turning around and saying that he's not going to use any nitrogen fertilizer on that after establishment, that's a fair commitment, and it says an awful lot about their experience of this and how well these swards can fix nitrogen. Of course, to fix nitrogen, the first thing is you have to have clover. And a lot of seed mixtures in the past probably didn't have enough clover. And the second thing is, if you put nitrogen fertilizer onto it, which is maybe what you're used to doing, that's one way of making sure that it probably won't fix nitrogen. So there's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario there.
There's one quick one here as well on, have you ever come across moss encroachment in red clover field, or how to deal with it?
No. No, and I think if there's moss encroachment, there's something gone wrong. And just, I suppose I spoke about red clover before, but that sounds to me like there's a declining population and plenty of space for light for the moss to get in on it. But I think potassium in particular is very key. Good soil fertility, red clover is absolutely dependent. People talked about soil fertility in soil ahead. You really need to have your soil fertility at a high pitch, particularly with red clover.
I think this viewer is saying to have good fertility, good pH, and free drain soils, but there could potentially be a compaction issue there. But it sounds of things maybe.
Yeah, could be something like that as well. Yeah.
Okay, James, we're going to have to wrap it up at that. I don't know where that hour went, but thanks for joining us this morning, and thanks for answering all those quite technical questions at times. And there's lots of resources available on the Teagasc website there. And if you want to link back to James's previous presentation there on red clover, just put it into a search bar there. It's very easy to find, and that the recording of that is available, and also the actual presentation. And I should have mentioned that this presentation, James' presentation, will be available to download on the Teagasc website as a PDF as well. And like all of the previous presentations are available there. We try to make sure that they're as accessible as possible. Cathal, thanks so much for helping with questions, and thanks to Yvonne Maher in the background here helping on the technical side. And we will see you next week. Just to highlight an event that's happening on Thursday, the 12th of June. It's Extensive Grassland Biodiversity event. It's happening in the County Arms in Birr, County Offaly, and also afterwards into Birr Castle, where there'll be a practical look at extensive grasslands. So do go onto the Teagasc website and check that out. That's on the 12th of June. So thanks very much. You've been listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, the weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. Don't forget to join us live every Friday morning for our latest webinar. For more, visit teagasc.ie. And you can also rate, review, and subscribe to the Signpost Series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. I'm Mark Gibson, and thanks for listening.